the end of the day, the shepherd, the one who knows them, separates them. That's what the sheep and goats thing is about. It is about Jesus separating us, and he knows us. But he isn't looking at our tails. On what basis are they separated? Verse 40, it's on how they have treated what Jesus refers to as the least of these brothers and sisters of mine. When Jesus talks about his brothers and sisters elsewhere in Matthew's Gospel, he's talking about his disciples. These are words from Matthew chapter 12. Pointing to his disciples, he said, "Here are my mother and my brothers, for whoever does the will of my Father in heaven is my brother and sister and mother." And the language of the least, that reminds us of the discussion some of Jesus' disciples had had about who would be greatest in the kingdom of heaven. And in reply, Jesus called a little child to him and placed a child among them. And he said, "Truly I tell you, unless you change and become like little children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Therefore, whoever takes the lowly position of this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. And whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me." So the least are those of Jesus' brothers and sisters who are not important, who have accepted the humble status that a child had in that culture. So Jesus is saying that he is dividing people up on the basis of how they have acted towards followers of Jesus, in particular those who aren't well known, aren't important, those who are in need, those who perhaps have been persecuted. And the people who have acted towards those people with love, mercy and justice are described by Jesus, those on his right, as you who are blessed by my Father. They are told to take your inheritance, the kingdom prepared for you since the creation of the world. In other words, they are to share in some way in the kingly rule of Jesus in this new heaven and earth which is coming, because their behaviour has shown that they have been a part of his kingdom all along. Now at this point you might be thinking, "Jennie, where were you when we did Romans just a few weeks ago? Don't you remember that righteousness is given through faith in Jesus Christ to all who believe, that all are justified freely by his grace through the redemption that came by Jesus Christ?" No, I haven't forgotten. Salvation is indeed by faith. But I don't think Paul was disagreeing with Jesus. What Jesus is talking about is the behaviour of those who love Jesus, who have come to know him, who have been saved, who are committed to following him and being his disciples. In the language of Paul in Romans, do they have the life of the Spirit, those who are now living by the Spirit, those who have been adopted are the children of God, who are brothers and sisters in Jesus, and therefore heirs of his kingdom. So this judgment, this separating out to right and to left, to inheritance in the kingdom on one side, and permanent separation from Jesus and his love and life on the other. This is done on the basis of how we have behaved, how we have responded to brothers and sisters in need, because that behaviour is a demonstration, an outworking of how we love Jesus, of how we respond to him. So, if we do love Jesus, it may be reading these words causes us to think, how are we to be ready? How am I, as someone who is loved by Jesus, who has Jesus as my King, how am I to live? And Jesus gives the same list 4 times, which must mean he wanted people to remember. We are to feed those who are hungry, give drink to those who are thirsty, invite in the stranger, give clothes to those who need them, care for the ill, and visit those in prison. It is a really practical list, isn't it, about meeting very practical needs. Some of those needs will be perhaps some that we aren't personally familiar with. We live in a very privileged place and time, although we'll all be sick at some time or another, and some of us will struggle financially and in other ways and need help. But Jesus' disciples, those whom he had sent out to spread the good news, they had already faced hunger and persecution. Those people listening to Jesus when he was speaking, few of them were well off. Hunger would not have been unusual, and in that climate, the hospitality of a drink from someone when you were away from home was necessary for life. And prison was soon to become a feature of life in the early church, as the authorities didn't like the inconvenience and disruption of people preaching the good news about Jesus. And Jesus says, if you belong to me, you will meet these needs. You will look out for your brothers and sisters. As children of the King, you will remember that the values of this King are love and compassion and mercy and justice, and that is how you will act to one another. And yes, here Jesus seems to be talking about how we treat other disciples, but we can see from elsewhere in the Bible and from examples through Christian history that this attitude of love to others is to extend to everyone. As everybody is made in God's image, everyone is loved by God, and so we are to love everyone. Which sounds so simple, and yet I know we find it hard to do and easy to ignore because it's difficult. But if we don't do these things, we've got a really hard warning here, haven't we? That we'll be judged and found wanting. It is a real challenge for us. So what does it mean for us today? Where do we start? Well, some examples maybe of what I know people are already doing. And everyday care of one another. If we know someone is struggling and we're personally able to help in whatever way, then that is what we do. And I know that already goes on in this church and from this church to wider beyond in all sorts of ways. And there will be lots that isn't seen by me or by anyone, and that is how it should be. Well done. When I go on to talk about other things, that isn't to dismiss the care and the love that we show informally and individually to one another, to those other people that we know. But this world that we live in is big and complex. Many people have fewer resources than we do. They are in need, but they are not nearby. And that is often where organisations come in to help us to care. We will be hearing in a few minutes from Compassion. We've got a video. So I'm not going to say much more about that because you will hear it in the video. But there are other organisations which St George's supports, which help relieve poverty and fight injustice. We support Wellspring in Stockport, an organisation working with those who, for all sorts of reasons, are homeless or at risk of being homeless. Maybe you joined in the rucksack challenge last Christmas. Maybe next Christmas you might want to join with a group to give in that way. As another example, this year we will, as a church, be giving to the Boaz Trust. I don't know if you've heard of them. They're a Christian organisation based in Manchester who support those who become homeless after claiming asylum. In their words, they are rooted in the teachings of Jesus Christ. We seek to serve those who society sees as the least, the last, and the lost. They are named Boaz after the story in the book of Ruth. Ruth was both a widow and a foreigner and pretty much destitute, needing to provide for herself and for her mother-in-law, and so she went to glean from the fields. Just as instructed in the Bible, we read those couple of verses from Leviticus. Grain had been left ungathered so that the poor and foreigners, those without any support of their own, any resources, so they could work to support themselves, to gather their own food. In that Leviticus reading, we see God's concern and care for those who have nothing, for those who do not belong, that they should be given food and dignity and fairness. And those themes bring me to a very local organisation, one which works with people who have arrived in this country from all sorts of places in desperate need of help. You may recognise this. Most of you will be familiar with Just Ice. Maybe it's your favourite place for lunch or a coffee, or even, who know, an ice cream. I know many of you volunteer there. People from here are trustees or work there, and of course it is headed up by Joe Rodman. So quite a number of you know better than I do the story of this young man, but for those who don't, Joe's given me some information. This is Hugh. Hugh was trafficked across Europe as a teenager, bought and sold as if he were a cheap commodity, and eventually shipped over the English Channel, hidden amongst pallets in the back of a freight wagon, until he found an opportunity to slip out and run for his life through city centre Birmingham. He was referred to the authorities and fostered, and later moved to Manchester, where his caseworker at Hope for Justice, another organisation, brought him to the Justice Cafe so he could begin learning employability skills and best practice in the workplace. He spent 2 years at Justice, and during that time he transformed from a timid, suspicious, withdrawn character, completely understandable given what he'd been through, into a confident young man ready to step out into the world, and he's recently moved into independent living in Manchester, working as a nail technician, his choice. He stays in touch with Justice and comes back for social occasions, which is lovely, isn't it? This is what Justice is all about, helping those who've been trafficked to the UK as victims of modern slavery or sex trafficking so they can rebuild their lives. But Justice also take an even wider view of justice. And so, for example, they use fair trade ingredients, and they're looking at how to become carbon neutral. You might think that fair trade and carbon neutral are a long way from where we started, from caring for the needy and the dispossessed and the sick. But in this world, the decisions we make, the decisions our governments make, the decisions that big companies make, they all affect the lives of everyone, but in particular, the lives of those who are already vulnerable are the ones most affected. If we're sold things at an unfairly low price, then someone is paying the price for that, whether it's a farmer growing the coffee or the cocoa or the tea or the person who's sewing our t-shirts. So how we shop can influence whether someone far away receives a fair wage. And even how we live affects people's livelihood elsewhere in the world. How we treat God's world, God's good creation, affects others. Of all the things which are difficult to think about, where we feel that anything we can do really won't make a difference, this must top the list. Just this week, I had a training day for curates, thinking about how we treat God's creation. One of my colleagues spoke about the effects of climate change, and she's kindly sent me some of her photos to show what she was talking about. Kate was born in the Solomon Islands, which are in the Pacific, northeast of Australia. This is a photo of the particular island that Kate's family come from. I think her family on her mother's side, if I remember correctly. This is a photo taken by one of Kate's relatives in the year 2000 of all the villagers gathered in front of their church. You can see there's a lot of greenery. Kate returns to the Solomon Islands for holidays when she can to meet up with family, and has taken photos of that same location since. This is 11 years later. Climate change has caused sea levels to rise and coastal erosion, and the church building at this point has already had to be abandoned. As you can see, it's right on the edge of the water. The sea comes up to it at high tide. Another 9 years later, the land on which that church building stood is completely beneath the water. This isn't just about a church building, though. The rising sea levels mean that much of the land no longer supports crops because it's been poisoned by salt. The people there also fish from dugout canoes, but that's getting harder and harder because, again, climate change has brought about coral bleaching, destroying fish habitats. Life is much more difficult. How we live and how we care for God's creation is a way in which we care for others. And yes, how to change what we do is complex, and it can be hard to work out the right thing. But looking at those pictures, hearing Kate talk brought home to me that climate change is something which is causing poverty and injustice and worse now. So if we're to love our neighbour, then doing nothing isn't an option. At the start of this sermon, I read these words from our vision statement. The call to follow God and the love that flows from him to us should overflow into love for each other, love for our community, love for the wider world and for the planet. That is, as I think we've seen, wide-ranging. You've heard a nudge from God about ways in which you could give, whether that's your time or your money, ways in which you could be involved, changes that you could make in how you live, or changes that we as a church could make. If so, then don't forget about it at the end of the service. Go and do something. Or maybe you're not sure yet, but there's something you need to go on thinking about. Again, don't forget. The need is immense, but our loving and just God calls us to act with love and justice to those in need. As a closing prayer, I'm going to read some of the words of our next hymn. God of the poor, friend of the weak, give us compassion, we pray. Melt our cold hearts, let tears fall like rain. Come, change our love from a spark to a flame.